Padre Pio saw exactly 3 demons enter that woman's home, and he described each of them to her husband before the man had said a single word. He told him their names. He told him which rooms they had claimed. He told him what specific wound in the family's spiritual life had given each one its point of entry. And then he told him what hour they returned every night without fail, waiting at the threshold, waiting for the household to go still and quiet and unguarded, 3 in the morning. If you have ever been woken at that hour with no explanation, heart racing, a cold pressure in the room you cannot name, a sense that something is present that should not be there, then what I am about to share with you is not going to surprise you. It is going to confirm something you already knew and were afraid to say aloud. Stay with me, because Padre Pio spent decades documenting what happens in the spiritual realm during these hours, and what he left behind in testimony, in letters, in the records of the men who knew him best, is one of the most precise and practically useful bodies of knowledge in the history of Catholic spiritual direction. By the end of this, you will know why this hour is chosen, what specifically happens during those attacks, and exactly what to do about it before tonight. There is something I need you to understand first, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. Most Catholics, when they think about spiritual attack, think about extraordinary cases, exorcisms, dramatic manifestations, the kinds of cases that end up in books or films and are treated by the rest of the world as curiosity or entertainment. And because those dramatic cases are what comes to mind, most Catholics also conclude, usually without saying it directly, that spiritual attack is something that happens to other people. To people with unusual histories or serious sins or some specific vulnerability they themselves do not possess. Padre Pio spent 50 years correcting this assumption. From the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo, hearing the interiors of tens of thousands of souls, seeing in the spiritual realm what attended their daily lives, he observed that the pattern of nighttime spiritual pressure on ordinary Catholic households was not rare. It was not unusual. It was, in his direct experience, remarkably common. Common enough that he eventually wrote about it with the precision of a man documenting a weather pattern, describing the conditions under which it intensified, the specific hours during which it was most active, the signals that indicated its presence, and the practices that consistently interrupted it. And the hour that appeared in his testimony, again and again, from case after case, from families in the farming communities of Foggia to visitors who had traveled from Rome and Milan and beyond, was always the same. 3 in the morning. Let me tell you something most people do not realize about this hour. It is not arbitrary. The choice of 3 in the morning for concentrated spiritual attack is not accidental, not superstition, not a detail that Catholic tradition simply invented over centuries of fearful imagination. It is precise, it is documented, and once you understand why it is chosen, everything else Padre Pio described about nighttime attacks will fall into place with a clarity that is, I warn you, not entirely comfortable. I've seen it with my own eyes, or rather, I have heard it from the mouths of people I trust absolutely, people in my own parish community in Coventry, men and women who had no reason to exaggerate and every reason to feel foolish about what they were describing. The person who woke every night at exactly the same minute for weeks. The child who could not sleep after a certain hour and could never say why. The couple who both described the same feeling of a presence in their bedroom at the same time of night, independently, without comparing notes, until the day they finally spoke to each other about it and went pale with the recognition. These are not troubled people. They are ordinary Catholics with ordinary lives and ordinary faith, which is precisely the point. Hold on. Because before I tell you what Padre Pio said about the mechanism of these attacks, I need to take you back to 1946 and to a woman named Teresa Marinelli. because her case is the one that appears most fully documented in the records of Father Gerardo di Flumeri, and her story is the one that makes everything Padre Pio taught about this hour comprehensible in a way that no amount of abstract explanation could achieve. Teresa was 34 years old in the spring of 1946. She lived in a small town in the province of Foggia, about 40 kilometers from San Giovanni Rotondo, with her husband Gianni, a school teacher, and their 3 children aged 9, 7, and 4. She was a daily Mass attendee, a woman of regular confession from a family that had maintained the traditional Catholic practices of southern Italy for generations. She was not dramatic, not prone to excessive religiosity, not a woman who saw omens in ordinary events. Her husband, Gianni, was by temperament a skeptic, a man who appreciated his faith in an intellectual way, but who kept a careful distance from what he privately considered the more superstitious elements of popular Catholic piety. The disturbances had begun in October of 1945. The first sign was the youngest child, Marco, who was 4 years old. He began waking in the night and screaming, not the crying of a child with a nightmare, not the gradual ascent from sleep that parents recognize, but an instantaneous, full-intensity terror that brought both parents out of bed and running before they were fully conscious. When they reached him, he would be sitting up in his cot, eyes open, pointing at the corner of the room, saying nothing coherent, just making a sound that Teresa described later as the sound of a person who had seen something so far outside their experience that the apparatus for naming it had simply failed. It always happened at the same time. Gianni had begun checking the clock in those first weeks, not because he expected a pattern, but out of the automatic human response to repeated experience. He found the pattern immediately. 3:17 in the morning, every time. Not approximately 3, not sometime in the early hours. 3:17 with a consistency that he could not explain and that he found more disturbing than the screaming itself. Then the 9-year-old Lucia began waking at the same hour. Not screaming, not pointing, simply awake, sitting in bed with her knees drawn up, staring at the wall, unresponsive for several minutes before gradually returning to herself, as though returning from somewhere distant. When she was old enough to describe it years later, she said that during those minutes she felt as though something was asking her a question she could not answer, and that the question was always the same, though she could never afterward recall what it was. Teresa began waking at 3:17 without any external trigger. She would simply be awake, and the quality of her wakefulness was different from ordinary insomnia, different from the wakefulness that accompanies a troubled mind or a difficult day. She described it to Padre Pio as a summoned wakefulness, as though something had called her out of sleep specifically, the way a knock on a door calls you out of a room. Gianni, who by this point had moved from skepticism into a quiet, private terror he expressed to no one, began recording the times in a small notebook. He recorded them for 3 months. The variation in the waking times across the 3 family members was never more than 4 minutes on either side of 3:17. He showed the notebook to Teresa without comment. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said she was going to San Giovanni Rotondo. Gianni did not argue. He had run out of arguments. She waited 3 days in the queue at the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie. On the morning of the 3rd day, a friar came to her in the line and told her that Padre Pio would hear her confession that afternoon. She sat in the confessional, and before she had said a word, Padre Pio told her the name of the town she came from. He told her the names of her children. He told her that the youngest, Marco, was the most directly targeted because he was the most spiritually exposed, having not yet received his first Holy Communion and therefore not yet carrying the specific sacramental protection it conferred. He told her that the corner of the room where Marco pointed was the corner where the entrance had first been established. And then he described, in the precise and unhurried way that those who recorded his testimony always noted, What was happening in the spiritual realm of her home between 3 and 4 in the morning, and why? What he told her next is the spiritual mechanism that I want to explain to you carefully, because it is not simple, but it is not obscure either. It is the kind of knowledge that, once you have it, makes an enormous amount of sense of experiences that previously seemed random or inexplicable. Padre Pio told Teresa that the hour of 3 in the morning held a specific and deliberate significance in the spiritual warfare directed against Catholic homes. Not the vague significance of superstition, not the cultural accident of a tradition that had simply attached a meaning to a time. A precise, documented, theologically grounded significance that he had confirmed through both direct spiritual observation and through his reading of the Church's own liturgical tradition. He said this: 3 in the afternoon, on the 14th of Nisan, was the hour of Christ's death on the cross. The 9th hour in the ancient Jewish reckoning of time, which the Church had always observed in the divine office, the hour of none, the hour at which the veil of the temple tore from top to bottom and the earth shook and darkness covered the land. The hour that the Church from its earliest centuries had treated as the holiest of the day, the hour of redemption, the hour of completed sacrifice. 3 in the morning is the direct inversion of that hour, the anti-hour. The hour that stands in the same relation to the hour of redemption, that darkness stands to light, that mockery stands to worship, that desecration stands to consecration. It is, in the tradition Padre Pio had absorbed and lived and confirmed through decades of direct spiritual observation, the hour most actively sought by the forces that oppose God and the families that attempt to live under his protection. He was careful to note that this did not mean every waking at 3 in the morning was a spiritual attack. The Church has never taught that. Padre Pio himself did not teach that. There are medical reasons for waking at specific hours. There are anxiety disorders and sleep disturbances and the natural rhythms of light sleep that characterize the pre-dawn hours in many people. He was not describing a mechanism that applied universally to every disturbed night in every household. He was describing a pattern that appeared in cases where the spiritual conditions for it were present, and distinguishing that pattern from ordinary insomnia required not dramatic discernment, but simple observation. The pattern had a consistency, a specificity, a quality of intentionality about it that ordinary insomnia lacked. The person with ordinary insomnia woke at various times for identifiable reasons, and their wakefulness had the texture of a mind working through its ordinary preoccupations. The person experiencing what Padre Pio described woke at a consistent time for no identifiable reason, and their wakefulness had a different quality entirely. A quality that those who had experienced both described with the same word independently across decades of testimony. It felt deliberate. And here is where the mechanism becomes specific and useful, because Padre Pio identified the conditions precisely. He told Teresa that 3 conditions had to be present for the nighttime pressure to establish itself as a consistent pattern in a household. The first was a reduction in active sacramental protection. Not necessarily the dramatic removal of all religious objects, though that was the most obvious form it took. More commonly, a gradual withdrawal of intentional prayer in the home. The grace of the sacraments was still present in the souls of the family members, but the active, daily exercise of that grace in the form of family prayer, blessing before meals, the rosary prayed together, blessing of children before sleep, the consistent use of sacramentals, when these had been reduced or abandoned by habit and busy schedules and the reasonable-sounding argument that they were not strictly necessary, a gap appeared in the spiritual architecture of the household. The second condition was the presence of an unresolved moral wound in at least one member of the household. Not necessarily a mortal sin, though mortal sin was the most serious version of it. More often, an unconfessed venial sin that had been rationalized, a wound of resentment or unforgiveness that had been given a home in the interior life of the person and allowed to persist. Padre Pio described this as providing a foothold, using a word that implied something much smaller than a door, a crack, a place where a finger might enter where a whole hand was not yet able to. The foothold did not require dramatic sin. It required persistent, unaddressed, unrepented damage to the interior life. The third condition was what Padre Pio described carefully as the sleeping of the guardian. Not the literal sleep or absence of the guardian angel, which he said did not and could not happen, but the functional inaccessibility that occurred when a person, night after night, entered sleep without the specific act of placing themselves under divine protection. Not as a formula, not as a mechanical repetition of words, but as a genuine, conscious, spoken act of trust that said, in whatever words came naturally, I am placing this night and this house and everyone in it under the authority of the one who purchased us. The guardian angel, Padre Pio said, was never absent, but its capacity to act was related, in some way he found difficult to explain in human terms, to the active invitation of the person it attended, not because the angel required permission, but because the person's free turning toward protection opened something that the person's passive unconsciousness left closed. When all three conditions were present simultaneously, the pattern of 3 in the morning became established. Once established, it was self-reinforcing. The disturbances disrupted sleep. Disrupted sleep increased anxiety. Anxiety increased the tendency toward interior withdrawal. Interior withdrawal deepened the first and second conditions. And the household, without understanding what was happening, began a slow, downward movement that could continue for months or years without anyone being able to identify its cause. Remember this, because the document I am about to describe to you makes this mechanism even more specific. In 1948, 2 years after Teresa Marinelli's visit to San Giovanni Rotondo, Father Lino Barbati, who had been under Padre Pio's spiritual direction for 11 years, made a specific written request. He asked Padre Pio to dictate to him, as precisely as he could, his understanding of nighttime spiritual attacks on ordinary households for use in his own spiritual direction work with families in his parish. He was dealing with an increasing number of cases and felt inadequately prepared. Padre Pio agreed. Over 3 separate sessions in Father Barbati's records, which were later incorporated into the broader documentation at the friary, Padre Pio described what he had observed across decades of ministry. Father Barbati's record of these sessions is not widely known. It has never been translated into English in its entirety. The portions I am drawing from here were referenced in the research of Father Di Flumeri and partially transcribed in a document that circulated among the Capuchin friars of San Giovanni Rotondo for years before finally being deposited in the friary archive. In those sessions, Padre Pio added something to what he had told Teresa Marinelli individually. He added the dimension of strategy. He said that the 3 conditions he had described were not simply stumbled upon by accident. They were specifically cultivated. The reduction of family prayer was not random. It was the result of a sustained and patient effort to make prayer feel optional, burdensome, unnecessary, or simply impractical given the demands of modern life. The unresolved moral wound was not random either. It was the result of sustained suggestions directed at specific vulnerabilities in specific people, suggestions that dressed themselves in the language of reason and self-preservation and perfectly acceptable emotion, until the person could no longer distinguish between their own thought and the thought that had been placed in them, and the sleeping of the guardian was not random. It was the direct objective of the first 2, because once the intentional act of placing oneself under protection at night had been replaced by unconscious habit and then by nothing at all, The threshold of the household in the small hours became accessible in a way that it was not otherwise. He said, "They are patient. They are very patient. They do not need to accomplish everything at once. They need only to move things in one direction, consistently, over time, in ways that feel to the household like the normal drift of a busy life. By the time the waking at 3 in the morning begins, the conditions have been in place for months." And then Padre Pio said something in those sessions that Father Barbati recorded verbatim, because he found it the most clarifying thing he had ever heard on the subject of spiritual warfare. He said, "The attack you can see is almost never the attack that matters. The attack that matters is the one that happened so slowly and looked so ordinary that nobody called it an attack at all. By the time the child begins screaming at 3 in the morning, you are not dealing with a beginning. You are dealing with a consequence. The question is not what to do about the screaming. The question is what allowed the 3 conditions to develop unnoticed over the months before the screaming began. Address the conditions, and the screaming ends. Address only the screaming, and the conditions remain in place for the next time." This is what I want to sit with you for a moment, because I think it is one of the most important things Padre Pio ever said about the nature of the spiritual opposition that ordinary Catholic families face. And it is the thing most likely to be dismissed, because it does not look like what we imagine spiritual attack should look like. We imagine something dramatic, something unmistakable, something that announces itself as clearly as the screaming of a 4-year-old pointing at the corner of a room. But Padre Pio described something patient and incremental, and dressed in the ordinary clothing of ordinary life. The family that used to pray the rosary together and now does not because they decided to stop, but because schedules got complicated and the habit gradually dissolved. The resentment that has been living in the marriage for 2 years, rationalized, managed, never confessed, never brought into the light. The bedtime that no longer includes a spoken word of prayer, not because anyone objected to prayer, but because by the end of the day everyone is too tired, and tomorrow is always another option. These are not dramatic. They do not feel like spiritual attack. They feel like the ordinary wear of ordinary life. And that, Padre Pio said, was precisely the point. Back to Teresa Marinelli. When she returned from San Giovanni Rotondo to her home in Foggia, she told Gianni everything Padre Pio had said. She told him about the 3 conditions. She told him what Padre Pio had said about the corner of Marco's room. She told him what he had said about Marco's specific vulnerability as a child, not yet confirmed in the sacraments. She told him about the anti-hour, the deliberate inversion of the hour of Christ's death, and why 3 in the morning had become so precisely the hour that appeared in case after case across decades of ministry. She told him all of it, and Gianni, who had kept his small notebook of times and who had watched his 4-year-old son point at the same corner of a room for 3 months, listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat with it for a while. Then he said, "Tell me what to do." This was the turning point. Not a vision, not a miraculous sign, not the dramatic experience that announces itself unmistakably as an encounter with the supernatural. A man sitting at his kitchen table in the evening saying, simply and without performance, "Tell me what to do. I have tried to explain this away, and I have run out of explanations. Tell me what to do." This was the turning point, not a dramatic conversion, not a vision or a miraculous sign. A man who had been a quiet skeptic sitting at his kitchen table in the evening and saying, simply and without performance, "Tell me what to do." And that is the document, not a papal decree, not a theological treatise, a husband's willingness to act. And what Padre Pio had given Teresa to bring home was, in the language of Father Barbati's record, 5 specific practices that consistently interrupted the pattern, not as a magical formula, not as a guarantee of outcome, but as the systematic reversal of the 3 conditions that had allowed the pattern to establish itself. I have thought about Teresa and Gianni's kitchen table conversation many times over the years. I think about a man who began as a skeptic and whose skepticism was not wrong, exactly, only inadequate to the experience his family was living. And I think about what it costs to say simply, "Tell me what to do." There is something in that willingness that is itself a form of prayer, the surrender of the need to understand before acting, the admission that there is a reality larger than what one's educated mind can currently account for, and the choice to respond to that reality with action rather than with more analysis. I've seen this in the families I have known longest. The moment when the explaining stops and the doing begins is always the turning point. Always. Now here is what Padre Pio gave Teresa to bring home. The 5 practices from Father Barbatti's record, preserved in the Friary archive at San Giovanni Rotondo. Practices that the Marinelli family applied beginning the first week of June 1946. And that, according to Teresa's own testimony to Father Di Flumeri, given 6 years later, produced results within 4 weeks and complete resolution within 2 months. The first practice he called the evening consecration. Before the household went to sleep, every member of the family who was old enough to understand should gather even briefly, even for 3 minutes. And one person, preferably the father or in his absence the mother, should speak aloud a prayer of explicit consecration. Not a formula prayer, not the rosary or the litany. Those are excellent and not excluded. But the specific act of naming this house and these people and placing them explicitly under the authority of God for the coming night. Padre Pio was specific that it should be spoken aloud, not thought silently. The spoken word carries a different weight in the spiritual realm than the interior intention. And the act of speaking it aloud as a household, even a household of 2 people, creates a communal act of spiritual claim that is qualitatively different from the private prayer of an individual. He said, "Say the names, name the people, name the house, name the night, claim them in the name of the Trinity. Do not be vague." The second practice was the blessing of children before sleep. Not the perfunctory making of the sign of the cross on a child's forehead that takes 2 seconds and requires no attention. A real blessing, with hands placed on the child's head, with a spoken prayer that names the child and places them specifically under the protection of their guardian angel and the intercession of the Virgin Mary. Padre Pio said that children, because they had not yet developed the interior walls that adults build over years, were the most spiritually permeable members of the household, the most sensitive to spiritual atmosphere, and therefore both the most vulnerable and the most reliable indicators. When the children were sleeping peacefully, the household's spiritual protection was functioning. When they were not, something needed attention. The third practice was the night application of holy water. Before going to bed, specifically applying holy water to the threshold of the bedroom and making the sign of the cross with it on the doorframe, accompanied by a brief, spoken prayer. Not as a ritual that worked independently of faith, as the physical expression of a spiritual claim being made in that specific location for that specific night. Padre Pio had described elsewhere what holy water did in the spiritual realm when used with genuine faith, and he connected that teaching to this specific practice. The bedroom threshold blessed each night with intention was a line that was harder to cross than one that had been left unmarked. The fourth practice was the midnight examination, not waking up at midnight deliberately, but this: if a person woke in the night, regardless of the hour, before doing anything else, before checking the time, before trying to understand what had woken them, before giving any attention to any thought or feeling or sense of presence, they should immediately, still half asleep if necessary, make the sign of the cross and say the name of Jesus aloud, however quietly, not after assessing the situation. First, before anything else, the sign of the cross and the holy name as the first response to unexpected wakefulness, before the mind had time to orient itself in any other direction. Padre Pio said that the first moments of unexpected wakefulness were the most spiritually charged moments of the night, and the direction in which attention turned in those first moments determined much of what followed. Turning toward God immediately, without condition, without first deciding whether the situation warranted it, was both the most effective protection and the most reliable way to identify whether the waking had a spiritual cause, because that immediate turn toward God either resolved the wakefulness into peaceful sleep or clarified the situation in a way that allowed the person to respond appropriately. The fifth practice was the monthly confession of the entire household. Padre Pio was direct about this. The unresolved moral wound was one of the three necessary conditions for the pattern to establish itself, and confession was the only means by which that wound could be genuinely addressed rather than managed. Not confession as routine, not the perfunctory recitation of a list of minor infractions. The confession that Padre Pio required of those who came to him was a genuine examination of interior life, specifically including the resentments and bitternesses and unforgiven injuries that people carried without calling them sins, because they had persuaded themselves that they were simply feelings or reasonable responses to real injuries rather than interior choices to maintain a wound that could be healed. He told Teresa that Gianni would need to examine this carefully because he had seen in her family's spiritual situation the presence of a specific, unconfessed bitterness in Gianni that had been there for more than 2 years, and that was the second of the 3 conditions Padre Pio had identified. He did not name the bitterness. He said Gianni would know what it was. Teresa told him. Gianni sat with it for a week. Then he went to confession. He told Father Di Flumeri years later that what happened in that confessional was the most significant interior event of his adult life. He did not describe it in dramatic terms. He said it was like a weight he had not noticed he was carrying being set down. He said he had not known until it was gone how much of his energy had been going into maintaining it. The waking at 3:17 in the morning stopped in the 4th week after the family began the 5 practices. Marco's screaming had already stopped in the 2nd week. Lucia returned to ordinary sleep. Teresa, who had been waking summoned from sleep for 7 months, slept through the night and did not wake feeling watched. She testified to Father Di Flumeri in 1952 that in the 6 years since their visit to Padre Pio, the pattern had never returned, that the household maintained the 5 practices consistently, that there had been interruptions, periods of a few weeks when the evening consecration was skipped or the monthly confession delayed, and that during those interruptions the children's sleep had again become disturbed briefly, enough to remind them, and they had returned to the practices without drama. She said, Padre Pio told us that the protection was not automatic. It was not a shield that operated independently of our daily choices. It required the same daily recommitment that any real relationship requires. We had learned that lesson the expensive way. We were not going to learn it a second time. You have just received something that Padre Pio spent decades developing from direct observation, and that he preserved in the testimony of Father Barbati and in the documented cases of Father Di Flumeri, precisely so that it would be available to ordinary families who were experiencing exactly what Teresa and Gianni Marinelli experienced without knowing what they were dealing with or what to do. These are not dramatic revelations for exceptional cases. They are practical knowledge for ordinary households in which the conditions for nighttime spiritual pressure have gradually been allowed to develop, often without anyone noticing, often while the family continued to maintain every visible form of Catholic life. The reason you rarely hear this from the pulpit is not that the Church disapproves of it. It is that this kind of specific, practical knowledge of spiritual warfare requires someone willing to go to the primary sources, to the men who lived alongside Padre Pio and who wrote down what he said in documents that were never intended for general publication. This channel exists to bring that knowledge to the people who need it. If this has reached you today, if you have been lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering what is wrong, if your children are disturbed in the night and you have found no satisfactory explanation, if your household feels heavier than it should, more anxious, more divided, more cold, then consider clicking the Super Thanks button below. It is not just a financial contribution. It is your way of saying that this testimony should keep reaching the families that need it. You are not just a viewer. You are part of why this knowledge travels from Padre Pio's testimony to the households that are waiting for it. Now let me close with the 5 practices in a form you can remember and apply tonight. The evening consecration. Before anyone in your household goes to sleep tonight, gather whoever is present, even if it is only you. Speak aloud, by name, a prayer that claims this house and these people for God for the coming night. Do not be vague. Name the people, name the house, speak the name of the Trinity. This will take 3 minutes. It is the single most important of the 5. 2. Bless your children before they sleep. Place your hands on their heads. Say their names. Ask their guardian angels to guard them through the night, and ask the Mother of God to cover them with her protection. Children whose parents bless them before sleep carry that blessing into the hours when they are most vulnerable. Do this even if they are old enough to find it slightly embarrassing, especially then. 3. Apply holy water to the threshold of your bedroom tonight. Touch the door frame with blessed water and make the sign of the cross over it, speaking a prayer of claim. This room and everyone in it belongs to God. If you do not have holy water, go to your parish this week and bring some home. Keep it near the door. 4. If you wake in the night, make the sign of the cross first, before you check the time, before you assess the situation, before you give your attention to anything else. The sign of the cross and the name of Jesus, spoken aloud if possible, whispered if not. First, always first. 5. Go to confession this month, not eventually, this month. Take the examination of conscience seriously, specifically including the resentments and bitternesses and carried wounds that you have been managing rather than addressing. Not because confession is magic, because the wound that has not been brought into the sacrament remains available as a foothold, and Padre Pio saw too many households living with the consequences of that availability to leave this point unstated. These 5 practices are not extraordinary. They do not require more than 20 minutes a day combined. They are the baseline of Catholic domestic spiritual life that Padre Pio spent 50 years trying to restore to ordinary families who had allowed it to erode. They are what Teresa Marinelli brought home from her 3 days in the queue at Santa Maria delle Grazie. They are what stopped the screaming and the pointing and the 317 wakenings in the 4th week. What happens in your home at 3 in the morning is not random. What you do about it does not have to be either. Now tell me something. Have you or someone in your family ever woken at exactly 3 in the morning with no explanation, heart racing, a sense of presence in the room that could not be accounted for? Write in the comments below. Not because I am collecting stories, but because you may be the confirmation that someone else needed to stop dismissing what they have been experiencing. Padre Pio never dismissed it. He named it, he documented it, and he gave people what they needed to address it. That work continues here, one household at a time.